Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Winter Storytelling. Woohoo! Back for 2025. We begin today's program by acknowledging that we are gathered today on the homeland of the Séliš and Kellis Bay people at a place they called Timsum Clee. Their example as the original stewards of this land guides our work today. Travelers Rest Connection is committed to respectfully sharing the history and contemporary culture of the indigenous people who lived and traveled through the ancient crossroads on this land. We learn from many indigenous artists, elders, and organizations, and we invite you to learn from and support them as well. I want to say a quick thank you to everyone who makes these programs possible. First and foremost, the members of Travelers Rest Connection. Everything we do is because of your generosity. Also, a big thank you to MCAT, Missoula's community media resource, who provided a media assistance grant to record our winter storytelling programs and to make them available on Zoom. Thanks to Colleen Frank and Kara Bartlett for treats today. If you want to sign up for treats for a future week, see me after the show. For folks who are joining us via Zoom, it's helpful if you keep yourself muted and your video off during the presentation, just to save bandwidth. If you have questions for our speaker, please type them into the chat box, and we'll monitor the chat for questions or for any technical difficulties you may have. And with that, I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Kicking us off today is a friend of the park. Aaron Jennings is a passionate preserver of songs and histories of Western traditions with a unique personal connection. In the early 1900s, Aaron's great-grandfather worked as both a cowboy driving cattle across the country and as a singing cowboy on the radio. Inspired by books of songs and poetry his grandfather left behind, Aaron picked up a guitar and learned how to yodel. We're excited to listen to Aaron's music and learn from him today. Aaron Jennings.
Thank you so much, Molly. Well, to start things off, I'd like to share a poem that my great-grandfather wrote that I feel kind of captures the spirit of Montana in a way that very few other aspects of Western poetry, or I feel modern Montana poetry seems to overlook. I'll share that, and then we'll get into something a little bit more detailed, but it's one of my very favorite poems. And one of the things that kind of started me down this whole road was this little book of songs and cowboy poetry that was sitting on my family's bookshelf that I found. And my great-grandfather wrote all of this down in the late 20s when he was in the Galen Sanitarium for tuberculosis, which I'm sure many of you have driven by. He was there for a year and a half, and the treatment at the time, which he jokes about in this book, was complete silence and having turpentine poured down your throat twice a day, which I thought was a joke, but if you look into what the treatment for tuberculosis was in the late 20s, they were pouring a concoction down your throat that smelled and tasted like turpentine. So, you know, he had a sense of humor, but all right. This is called Big Sky Country, or The Generous Years. Did you ever look out over the rolling plains at the tall green grass from the soft spring rains and watch little calves frolic and play, glad, I'm sure, for such a beautiful day? Hear the meadowlark sing and the curlews cry. Far overhead, scattered clouds float by. See the wild flowers blooming so fair, while scent from wild roses freshens the air. That's Montana. Did you ever look out at desolation when dirt storms swirled across our nation? Water was gone from creek and well, and the west wind felt like a blast from hell. Grasshoppers came, the ground was bare, sometimes they seemed to fill the air, and you think that God had passed you by when you listen to hungry children cry. That's Montana. Did you ever look out at a sea of gold? Before your eyes is wealth untold, wheat as far as the eyes can see. It's harvest time for you and me. Then the country takes on a different look, like turning the page in a picture book. Farmers paying back debts, no doubt, or buying things that they did without. That's Montana. Did you ever look out at a world of white when a raging blizzard had come in the night, and you knew you must dress and saddle and go, or lose your own little herd in the snow? You are glad for the chaps that warm your knees. You think your hands and feet will freeze. But at the end of the day, all is well. Your herd is safe in the home corral. That's Montana, the big sky country. So I found this book, and probably when I was about 11 years old, and started expressing some interest. And my parents were like, "Oh yeah, well we've got his guitar too." And no one in my family played, and it was kind of, I wasn't really allowed to touch it until I knew how to play, and that took a couple decades. So that kind of the treasured memory of my great-grandfather, who was somebody that I had never met, but who was everybody in my family kind of put on this pedestal as a legendary sort of character, who, both in good ways and bad ways. And so I spent a good part of my youth and my adulthood like trying to like find out more about that story, and kind of put it into context, because it was all so long ago. And what part of that meant like learning about like what he was doing back then, which he was a dude cowboy singing on dude ranches, and guest ranches, which were a hot new thing. He had been a real cowboy working for the Matador Cattle Company, which is a pretty huge, sweeping. I'm not an expert in some of the cattle history, but my understanding is Matador has basically turned into what we understand as big beef today, is made up out of the Matador Company and other national cattle enterprises. And he was there right at the beginning when they started buying up other ranches. And then he found out that he could make more money hanging out at these guest ranches, playing songs and leading people around on little horse walks and trails, and it was a lot nicer than it was to actually drive cattle and be a real cowboy. And that was at a time when the realities of being a cowboy were pretty much gone and dying. So, at least my understanding is. So to take this into context, one of the things that I learned about was that the very first cowboy song that we have is When the Work Is All Done This Fall, which was written by a guy named DJ O'Malley in the late 1800s, in the 1890s, in Montana. DJ O'Malley was not from Montana, but he worked out in Montana pretty extensively and owned land and cattle. And so that's the first published cowboy song or poem. He'd published it in an outdoorsman journal in the late 1800s. And what it was a song that he and his friends had been singing around the campfires, and everyone thought it was good enough that he should put it down. And the funny thing is, it's actually written to the tune of a very popular kind of pop song called After the Ball. So in a lot of ways, the very first cowboy song is a satire on popular music, and he talks about that in interviews and says that, well, everybody knew the song, so we could all sit around and play it, but nobody wanted to sing those words. And so that's how When the Work's All Done This Fall came about, and I'd like to play it for you now. A group of jolly cowboys discussing plans at ease said, "Boys, I'll tell you something now, if you will listen, please. I am an old cowpuncher, oh, before you dressed in rags. But I used to be a good one, and I'd go on great big jags. Well, I have got a home, boys, a good one, you all know, although I haven't seen it since many years ago. I'm going back tomorrow to see them one and all. I'm going to see my mother when the work's all done this fall. That very night that cowboy went out to stand his guard. The night was dark and cloudy, it was storming very hard. The cattle, they got frightened and they rushed in wild stampede. The cowboy tried to head them off while riding at full speed. Riding through the darkness, you heard the cowboy shout, "Come on!" Trying hard to head them off, to turn the herd about. His saddle horse got frightened and it crushed him in a fall. He'll not see his mother when the work's all done this fall. Bill, take my saddle. George, take my bed. Fred can have my pistol right after I am dead. Please think of me kindly when you look upon them all, for I'll not see my mother when the work's all done this fall. We buried Charlie at daybreak, no tombstone for his head, just a little wooden board, and this is what it read. Charlie died at sunrise, and he died from a fall. He'll not see his mother when the work's all done this fall. Thank you. Yeah, it's kind of a long song, but that was the thing, is you had to squeeze every bit of entertainment that you could out of a song back in those days, Imagine a couple guys sitting around with harmonicas and banjos, probably. Or not, really, that was one thing about old cowboy music is, as music got more popular, it wasn't common for more than one guy to have a guitar, because it's pretty hard to haul that stuff around with you actually on the trail. So, and even then, harmonicas were kind of expensive, and they also get broken and dirty and dusty, and so, a lot of the music was about singing together, and the thing about using After the Ball was it was available as a piece of sheet music as far back as 1880, and it was cheap. It was everywhere. So they picked up a piece of sheet music, and it had all the words on it, and they just crossed it out and put their own next to it. So another thing about my great-grandfather is that kind of spurred me down this whole path is in this book here, it has one of his songs, and between two of the verses, it has in parentheses, "Yodel here." And I was only vaguely aware of what a yodel was, and I thought, oh, that's I went and found some yodeling music, and gee, that's weird. And I thought, well, it doesn't sound too hard. I was wrong. And a funny thing, what I learned about my great-grandfather was in 1927 he had gone to a radio audition in Lead, North Dakota, South Dakota, North Dakota, South Dakota. It's right near the border, isn't it? I've been there, but it was during the Sturgis, South Dakota bike rally, so my memories are a little fuzzy. And the whole area was just packed with motorcycles, so your sense of geography was shot. But in any case, he attended this radio audition. They were like, "Hey, that's great. You've got a show," in Minneapolis. And so he had just had a son, my grandfather, and was like, "Well, good luck, honey. I'm gonna go out to Minneapolis and go take a shot on the radio." So I have a picture of him holding this guitar. With a band behind him and a whole orchestra, actually. And the case this comes in says Jim Jennings and his orchestra on there. So the thing is cowboy music back then, it wasn't like in the late 1920s, it was becoming pop music. Like it wasn't a thing necessarily where it was just, there was hillbilly music and folk music with one guy and a fiddle on the radio, and that had been around for a long time. But cowboy music in the late 20s was stepping into the forefront as pop music because of Jimmy Rogers. And so my great-grandfather, one of the songs he had written was a straight Jimmy Rogers knockoff. And it says so, done to the tune of Jimmy Rogers' Blue Yodel. And the thing is for him to have heard that song in 1927 and then turned around and immediately written a copy of it and then used it at a radio audition, we think about communication totally differently than we do now. For him to have even heard that song is kind of a mean feat because 1927 is when Jimmy Rogers recorded and released that song. So, he was hip. He was checking out the new music, and he was a yodeling cowboy. DJ O'Malley, in his very last interview before he died, said that any true cowboy who could yodel would not. So, we have these two very conflicting things where it's like, well, I know my great-grandfather was a real cowboy. That's how he was raised. His family moved to Montana in 1904, and then they had a family ranch outside of Ennis. And he immediately got into driving cattle in his teens. And my grandfather, his son, also grew up doing all that stuff, but he loved to yodel, but DJ O'Malley had a different opinion, and that's kind of one of the things I mean about how drastically cowboy culture was changing. DJ O'Malley talks about it in the late 1800s. They knew it was going away with the railroad and everything, and loading cattle onto cars. They were like, this isn't going to last, and they were like holding on to it because they loved it and they loved the independence of it, and they loved being out in nature. And Jimmy Rogers, when he came around, he like never got to do any of that. He just had heard about it and thought it was great and loved the idea of that kind of lifestyle too. Everybody did, because we were coming out of some of the worst periods of American history, in modern American history, of the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. And no one can find a job, and man, the idea of just being out on the range and having beans every night sure sounds pretty good, and the idea of glamorizing it came around. So Jimmy Rogers was kind of the first guy to capitalize on that by writing songs that really, he and Gene Autry were best friends, and you may have heard of Gene Autry as the yodeling cowboy too. Fun fact, Gene Autry didn't take that name, that moniker, until after Jimmy Rogers had been dead for a year, out of respect for him, because they'd been good friends. And there's a lot of ground to cover there, but I'd like to play you a song, and I'll dedicate it to DJ O'Malley, and it's called I Love to Yodel. I love to yodel, I yip-dee-dee-dee. Oh, all the songs of romance in the spring. I could serenade a pony, but it won't be matrimony. He can't buy a golden wedding ring. listen but the cows. So I'll yodel lullabies as I gaze into their eyes. They seem to like the melody somehow. I love to yodel, I yippee-lady, and there's a handsome cowgirl that I know. Hi there, Molly. Well, I'd love to do her cooking. Gee, is she good looking? She could be an actress on Yellowstone. Take that, DJ O'Malley. I'm not a real cowboy, though. I've ridden a horse 2 times. I did muck stables out for my friend's mom, though, when she would go on vacation when I was 17 and 18. I would do that for 3 months at a time, and that gave me, I think, the best view of horses. They can be mean. So I'll share one more anecdote about my great-grandfather, which was he had that radio show in Minneapolis for about 6 months when his wife passed away, and he had to leave Minneapolis and come back home to take care of his son. And he came back home and settled things out, moved in with his parents out in Ennis, and then which, nowadays we would probably think that a man in his late 20s moving back in with his parents was, pretty not a great thing, but I think it was the right move for him at that time. But he actually, he ended up putting his son with his wife's sister, and then going back out and doing normal cowboy work again, just because he had to make some money. And that's when he got tuberculosis. Because that wasn't good work by 1927, by late 1927. So he got tuberculosis and ended up coming back to Galen, to the sanitarium, for a year and a half. And by the time he got out, he says in that book there that by the time he got out, his singing voice was wrecked, and he was sorry, it was like, I'm never going to sing the way I did again, and probably just not going to sing anymore. So, but he did write this song and dedicated it to his wife. So I'll sing it for you now. My great-grandmother. Oh, often in my dreams we're together, riding the old prairie trail, underneath the moon, while I'd sing a tune of my love for you that never failed. Wild roses blooming on the prairie often remind me of you. I can still see you there with that rose in your hair. It was then we vowed we'd always be true, just like a flower you bloomed for a day till the angels came down, took you away. And I'm lonely when the wild roses bloom on the plain, for they bring back memories of you. love for you that never failed, and wild roses blooming on the prairie often remind me of you. I can still see you there with that rose in your hair. It was then we vowed we'd always be true, and just like a flower, you bloomed for a day until the angels came down and they took you away. And I'm lonely when the wild roses bloom on the plain, boy, they bring back memories of you, you. Thank you very much. Song's a little melodramatic, but something that is written in John Lomax's Folk Songs of North America is that there's only a certain number of things you can write folk songs about. And right at the top of that list is death. And you'll notice that that's a theme, from when the work's all done this fall. Two of the things that you can write folk songs about: home and death. And that goes back at least hundreds, as far back as documented Western music and folk songs, and probably a lot further back than that. There's just a few themes that always resonate with humanity, regardless of where you're coming from. And I feel like cowboy music, it's part of that folk music tradition that's coming from a people and a place. It just happens to be a people and a place that moved around a whole lot and, was not necessarily nailed down. And that's why cowboy music it means a lot of different things to different people too, and you get different styles and flavors of it because, people were driving cattle, all across the West, and so they were coming into contact with Northern song family traditions and Southern song family traditions, and then a lot of the people doing that work were immigrants to begin with. So it was an excellent. The Western traditions were an excellent melting pot of different music traditions it's why there's kind of Western flavors of all kinds of music. Like there's in fact one of my very favorites, which we'll move on to next, which is Western swing. So like I said, the idea of a cowboy as a hip guy, started happening in the late 20s, and we started seeing all the as soon as soundies became a thing, and we had films with audio, like, what's the first thing they started making a ton of? Little movies with cowboys and popular Western singers. And also even, we think of the guitar today, it's just a given, like, oh yeah, people play guitar. In 1927, not a lot of people played guitar, just as a physical demonstration. This guitar is from 1947, okay? My great-grandfather bought this in a pawn shop in 1926, okay? See the size difference between them? This was about the biggest guitar that you could buy in 1927. And they're not very loud. Like, imagine sitting around trying, in a small club or something with as many people as are here, trying to be loud enough to be heard without microphones or speakers. Like, it's pretty hard. And so the thing was that most people played, that was the age of banjos and mandolins, because they're really loud acoustically, and you can sing over the top of them and still be heard. But cowboy singers started making the guitar popular, and everybody wanted to hear more guitar, and it became a popular rhythm instrument. So it pushed instrument builders into a size battle, like industry and art, or like especially when there's money involved, push each other. So in the late 20s, all of the guitar manufacturers were like, oh, we need to start building bigger guitars. How do we do that? There's money there. And they figured out all kinds of stuff that evolve the guitar into the instrument that we know and love today. And so really I could talk about that for a long time, trying to just give you guys the high points. But a big part of it was the Gibson company, and then the Epiphone company. So Gibson was in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and they were a big deal. They had the biggest archtop guitar in 1930. And Epiphone was like, hey, they were a smaller company. Like, how can we challenge that? Oh, I know. We'll make a bunch of instruments that are 1/2 inch bigger than the Gibson ones. And and they put a big ad out saying that, all our guitars are just a little bit bigger and louder. And Gibson got really mad, and then the next year all of their guitars were a little bit bigger than the Epiphone ones. And this continued all the way until you get into 1941, when Gibson came out with the Super 400 guitar, which that was named for how much it cost. It cost $400, which, yeah, that's a lot of money back then. You could probably get a used car, for less than that, for sure, at that point. And then Epiphone, of course, came out just a few months later with the Emperor, which was 1/2 inch larger than that. But those are still the two biggest guitars ever made. Like those two models, they hit the pinnacle of what you could do with an acoustic instrument in the 40s through there. And everyone's kind of accepted that there's no point going any further, because just the physics of what you can do are kind of there. Anyway, so cowboy music was a hip and cool thing, and jazz was also becoming a hip and cool thing. And I'm a big fan of Bob Wills and Texas Playboys, and there's this whole interplay of cowboy culture with popular culture that brings about, like, how can we have cowboy music that everyone can dance to? and then we get Western swing, which Western swing is beautiful because it's that intersection of cultures, of people who are traveling in the deep South, and then still, and had a connection with, Louisiana, and Texas had jazz clubs too. That's a thing that gets overlooked, is that, like, the southern border, San Antonio and Dallas, they had jazz clubs going back all the way into the 20s too. So you had this thing of traveling musicians who started hitting the jazz clubs along their circuit, and were playing in cow towns, and so they're like, well, let's take these cowboy songs and let's dress them up in jazz tunes. And it created a whole new kind of music, which, you can draw a direct line from Western swing, which is where we get the first electric guitar solo, is on a Bob Wills song, a Western swing song. First time that you hear a recorded electrified guitar on a song is a Western swing song. So we can blame cowboy music for rock and roll, is basically what I'm getting at. But I would like to play you a song that this actually is another instance of pop songs getting recycled in cowboy music. And this song was done originally by one of the very last vaudeville blackface performers, but it was hugely, hugely popular for years and years. Everybody knew this song. And then Jimmy Rogers covered it, and then Hank Williams Sr. covered it, and and Bob Wills covered it. And it's one of those great songs that keeps coming back, because it's just a great folk song like that. So I'm gonna play that one for you. This song is now out of copyright, everybody. Just say. Well, there's a rumor going around, I began to think it's true. It's awful hard to love someone when they don't care about you. Well, once I had a loving gal, sweet little thing around, but now she's done left me. Lord, she done turned me down, and I ain't got nobody. Well, nobody cares for me, and that's why I'm sad and lonely. Well, won't somebody come take a chance with me? I'll sing you sweet love songs, honey, all the time, if you'll be that loving mama of mine. But I ain't got nobody, and nobody cares for me. I'll sing you sweet love songs, honey, all the time, if you'll be that loving mama of mine. But I ain't got nobody, and nobody cares for me, and nobody cares for me, oh Lord. Thank you. Yodeling before noon. Well, I guess it's okay to talk a little bit about myself. One of those times that I was riding a horse. Well, let's see. I moved. Let's go all the way back here. So I was born in Texas, actually. My father was born in Montana. My grandfather was born in Montana. But my dad was in the military, and he got out of the military in Texas right before I was born. So we were always on our way back to Montana. We just didn't get here till I was about 11. So just to put into context why that thing about my great-grandfather, it latched onto me, because it wasn't just him, it was also a place that we had been on our way to for a long time. And when we first moved to Montana, we lived 20 miles north of Whitefish, just a couple miles down the road from Olney and the Stillwater Bar, if you've been up there, just off the side of Highway 93. And, there was nothing out there back then. And it really did feel like and before that, we'd been living in Tacoma, Washington for a couple years. So I kind of went it was just a little bit of a culture shock for me to suddenly, be out in the middle of nowhere, and right behind our house it was Forest Service land, and so I could just go for a walk in the woods and have no idea where it stopped. It was a whole new world for me. When I moved to Missoula, I started getting more into music, and I ended up doing a lot of work a lot of free work for the university in the theater department and dance departments, stuff like that. And getting into event production, where then I started working as a stagehand for Rocky Mountain Rigging, where I got to build stages for over 300 shows all across the Northwest. And one of those occasions was at a Willie Nelson concert, where I got to ride a horse. It was at the Jackson Ski Resort, and they said, "Hey, Willie, we offered to let Willie ride a horse over the top of the mountain, but he didn't want to do it. Do you want to do it?" And I was like, I'll take Willie Nelson's secondhand horse ride. So anyway, all that being said, eventually I started working as a tower climber, climbing towers because of my work doing rigging for the stage building. And then after enough long winter drives and climbs to the top of mountains, I was like, well, maybe I should just play music instead. Because man, you really learn what's valuable in life after you're driving home on like Christmas Eve at 4 in the morning in a winter storm from Great Falls back to Missoula. Like it's on a bad night. I don't know. I'm sure many of you have been there. So in 2019, I decided to quit my job and pursue music full time and tour the country. And it was great timing on my part. Did about 6,000-mile loop from Missoula and back, and then started a second one right in time for the whole pandemic crap to start. And pardon my French, le crap. And I was in Texas when all of my gigs started getting canceled, and I came back to Missoula, and I wrote a couple songs. So I'll just play one of the songs I wrote right when I got back. Maybe you'll like it. I wake up every morning with a smile on my face and boundless hope and optimism for the human race. But hard times, oh, they're hard times, and they're spreading like bad news. Oh, I never thought I'd see the day when yodelers get the blues. I'll sell all my country records. I'll put the bottle down and get a job. Well, nobody wants to hear my guitar, and I can't borrow from my mom. I'm downhearted and despondent, a little depressed too. And though I hate to admit it, even a yodeler gets the blues. A Sometimes I kind of get where DJ O'Malley is coming from, though. So, after the idea of like touring live as a way to sustain myself and my family seemed like a bad idea, started thinking about other things that were music adjacent that I could do. And one of the things that I latched onto was I had found these my aunt had found these old records that had my great-grandfather's name on them. And she was like, yeah, we've never been able to get him to play though. And she gave me the records, and I'm a big nerd for old gear and old music equipment, you know, the whole rabbit hole of getting into that world of music and that era of music that I love. And so I was like, I'm going to figure it out. Why the heck couldn't it play on a normal record player, right? So what I discovered were that those records had been made using a kind of a home record cutting machine from the early 30s. That nowadays we don't think about that, but you know, before there was tape, you know, how would you how would you record a message for somebody? And that was the thing, is there was this whole market of record cutters where it would have a radio built in, a place to plug in a microphone, and you could record a letter to Ma and then stick it in the mail and send it off, and you could go down to the store and buy little stacks of blank records. The thing is, though, is that nowadays those were designed to play on 1930s electrical record players, which are totally different than anything you can get your hands on today in a store. But I brought along something that I've rigged up to play one of those records for you, and I'd like to play one for you now if you'd like to. I've never played these in public before, but we can listen to the sound of my great-grandfather singing and playing in as close to real time as anyone will ever hear. And now, here's the thing about these old record cutting machines is that, like I said, it's letter to mom quality. This is like this. It's going to be a little noisy. It's going to sound a little weird, but it's a unique opportunity to get to hear something that is in the way that it was intended to be heard almost 100 years ago. So. I've really gotten into this stuff, and I had the opportunity to do a residency, an artist residency in Butte, where I had access to the Butte Silver, which they had also had no idea how to play. So I transferred a whole bunch of Butte recordings as well, which we could have a whole nother hour to talk about Butte and how much I love Butte, but I'll tell you the things that came out of that library will shock a person. All right, so this is the Red River Valley from 1932, which this is post-tuberculosis for him, so he says he's got a terrible singing voice here, so we'll just cut him a little slack. We can listen to some more later too. I'm not sure where we're at on time, but
Well, I wanted to give folks time to ask you questions, if that's all right.
sure. I'll do one more thing just to wrap it up. So.
Yeah.
So the other thing that so I got into record cutting, and then later in during the American Rescue Plan Act, the Montana Arts Council was given a huge grant opportunity to fund different art projects. And I was very lucky to get a grant to purchase a record cutting machine from the 1940s that a friend, now a friend, but a guy that I know reconditioned and rebuilt for me so that I can cut my own records one at a time in real time. And so I made 5 of these for today, but this is a record that I made last night on polycarbonate plastic on a 1940s record cutting machine. And this is a recording I made in 2018 that was recorded all live with a band of 14 people, and none of us rehearsed, doing all classic yodeling songs from, I think our cutoff date was 1954, was the latest song that we did. And just as this will give you a brief example of the difference between the quality of the recording we just heard and something slightly more modern, but and I thought it'd be fun. And then we'll do a little Q&A.
I wanna be a cowboy, sweetheart. I wanna learn to rope and to ride. Oh, riding o'er the plains and the desert, out west of the Great Divide. I wanna hear the coyotes howling while the sun sinks in the west. I wanna be a cowboy, sweetheart. That's the life that I love best. Ay-yo-lo-yo, ay-yo-lo-yeah, ay-yo-lo-yo, ay-yo-le-yeah, ay-yo-lo-yo, ay-yo-le.
There you go. One last little bit of fun family trivia before we get to the questions. I've got several books laid out there for people to look through if they'd like. 2 books by my great grandfather. Oh. Sorry, I turned that off during the record. So I have a few books over there for people to look through. 2 are books that were written by my great-grandfather and published by his son later. One is a book mostly of poetry, and the other is songs and poetry. Feel free to pick them up and look through them. Sorry, this is going to bug me. There, I could hear that little whistle. And then next to that, you'll see a weird book that's Through the Shadows with O. Henry, which is actually a autobiography by Al Jennings, who was a cousin of my great-grandfather's, who was known as the biggest mouth in the Wild West. And he became he actually was arrested as part of a failed robbery of a postal train. He was the only guy that got caught. He was part of the James gang. And he was caught. He had $27 on him from the robbery, and he went to jail for life. But because that's what happened when you robbed a train, But his cellmate was O. Henry, and they became friends. And when O. Henry got out and became a famous writer, he was like, "Hey, all those stories you were telling me were great. Like, I published one of them, and I think I can get you out." And so he actually got a presidential pardon. And ended up moving to Hollywood and becoming a fixture in the Hollywood scene until the 60s, and consulted on as an authentic Western bandit on all of the cowboy movies and all all the historians around are like, yeah, I mean, he was around, but he wasn't, if he was, no, you know, he could always make a connection to these famous gangs, but never really seemed to have been there very long. So feel free to look through those. And my grandfather, Jim Jennings, he lived in St. Ignatius and operated a little museum and a print shop and started a newspaper in St. Ignatius. And he published all the little books. And he also ran Robert's Roost knife shop out there. And so some of you may have run across him or something that he made over the years. But feel free to look through all that stuff. Absolutely.
Anybody?
Are you familiar with Teddy Blue Abbott?
Teddy Blue Abbott? No, I'm not familiar with Teddy Blue Abbott.
Talks all about the early days of the cattle drives. He worked for all the big companies in Montana, brought cattle up from Texas, and it's fascinating.
Oh, that's great.
He talks about singing on night herd, and maybe have a guy on each side of the herd when they're bedded down. One of them sing one course and one would sing the other course, and the cows would listen to that instead of all the background noise. They start them to stampede.
Oh, that's great. So Teddy Blue Abbott. Do you remember the title of the book?
We Point Them North.
Point Them North. Right. I have heard of that book. That's great. We pointed them north, right? Yeah. No, and that's a reoccurring reference, you know, across so much cowboy literature. I've got to read that book, Teddy Blue Abbott. We pointed them north.
Wasn't he a good friend of C.M. Russell?
Yeah, he was a friend of Charlie Russell's and Granville Stewart and Landusky, and he's really got some good stories to tell.
Oh, that's great.
Besides about singing. He was quite a singer. But he said if they'd run out of lyrics, they should make up stuff while we were.
Right. Because it didn't have to be perfect. It just had to get the job done.
No guitars or anything, just voice.
Yeah.
We really enjoyed this.
Oh, thank you.
Go pick up a birthday.
It's my son's birthday party today, too. So, yep. Yeah. Have a great day.
Has your path ever crossed with Wailing Gustafson?
Only, what's funny is several of the people who play in my band have played in his band or from time to time, and so it's always by one degree of separation. One time I was in Conrad to play a rock and roll show with a different band, and I went into the grocery store there, and they had a Wailing Gustafson cardboard cutout at the thing with his CDs, and I had just really been getting into yodeling at that point, and felt pretty, you know, was feeling of my spurs, so to speak. And I said, "Oh, Wailing Gustafson, like, is he like from around here?" And they were like, "Oh yeah, he just left like 5 minutes ago." And I said, "Oh, will you tell him Aaron Jennings is coming for him?" And so I've always wondered if that got back to him, because like he sent me like talked just a little bit online, and he's always very nice but very short.
Just a fun factoid. Gustafson's ranch was originally in Ennis.
Oh, wow.
In fact, an old college buddy of mine, Gary Gustafson, lives on that ranch now in Ennis. And you might want to stop by there sometime, because I'm just thinking, going back 3 or 4 generations, the Gustafson family must have crossed paths with your family.
Yeah, you're not kidding. That's a
Wiley's cousin, Gary.
okay. Well, I definitely could get the word over to him. Cool. Thank you for that.
Scott?
On your great-grandfather's song about his wife and stuff, did he write down the chord changes, or did you hear a song of his, or how do you know the chord changes, and then how do you know the vocal changes, how much of that do you have to kind of intuit?
So if you look in the book over there, you'll see that usually most of them it just says foxtrot or it just has the tempo type. So I did a lot of interpretation, especially on that song. I arranged that when I was probably 21 and barely knew anything about Western music. So that one has a little bit of a modern flair, but I've been playing it that way so long and can't probably not going to change it too much now, you know. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's funny that there is only one song in there that tells you what he's doing. It says to the tune of Jimmy Rogers' Blue Yodel #2, I think it is, and it's and that was actually what launched me down the musical tradition. Was okay, he was listening to Jimmy Rogers. I need to go listen to Jimmy Rogers, and then that opened a whole world to me that I'm still kind of exploring.
Is there a whole history of yodeling before?
There is. Actually, yodeling, most anthropologists are convinced that it predates human language, like any formal type of language, because there are primates that do it and other types of animals, and it specifically yodeling it requires a glottis or a similar type of thing of two sets of vocal cords, because there's a physical thing that happens when you yodel, like hear how that fills the room, and you can so there's something in your brain and in the way the ears work that hears that sudden air pressure change differently, and it carries much further than other types of sounds. So there's a great book called Yodel-e-He-Hu, The Secret History of Yodeling by Bart Plantega. But what's fun thing about yodeling is that it's actually been found independently on every continent except Antarctica by different indigenous cultures. Every single one that had no, there's no cultural contamination. These are traditional, things. And it's all very different. It can have different contexts, but it's that physical action of using the glottis and the jump. So there's a whole every culture not every culture held on to that, but and kept it in ritual, and in their culture, but it's there.
Been around a long time.
It has, yeah, and American yodeling is actually really kind of unique because we brought a lot of the old yodeling over from Europe, European traditions, different types of yodeling from different parts of Europe and singing. And then the classic thing about American folk traditions and European folk traditions is that a lot of the European folk traditions are actually more purely preserved in America than they are in Europe, because European culture was in a massive upheaval, and all those old world immigrants came over to America and were holding on to those values and keeping them special, whereas in Europe they were out with the old in with the new, and not to mention all kinds of fascism and other things stomping out indigenous and rural cultures. There's a whole thing about the Germanic folk reconstitution where they actually outlawed a type of yodeling. In Alpen yodeling, you're not allowed to make the E sound, yodel-e-he-hu, and no double E. And it's not Germanic, And so that's a whole thing today, even where classical Alpen yodeling actually is omitting a whole style of music where that tradition comes from. So it's kind of in America, they didn't care about any of that stuff, and they just kept doing the songs the way they always had done. So you can find that in a lot of different European musical traditions.
So, oh, sorry, do you have a question over here?
Yeah, when I hear yodeling and cowboy songs, especially you talk about the range, it reminds me of coyotes,
Yeah.
Is there any?
Well, a coyote, the way they're yipping it's a type of a yodel, the low, high, high, low, and it carries over a huge distance. It's a mammalian thing. And I do think there's a real connection there. And there's a whole other song I could play that tells you that yes, that's how the yodel was born. A wandering cowboy hears a coyote and a whippoorwill. You know, and the imagery, being alone out on the range. It is that funny thing too of, you take a European tradition that was used, in the mountains to communicate and be heard a long time, and now you're way out on the plains, and it's that how do you connect a place-based, like, cultural thing to the new place that you're in? It's like that's one of the fascinating things and yodeling in America is like the mountaintop Alpine yodeling thing is more of a thing they talk about doing back home than in America. Like, oh, I went up to the top of the Rockies and I yodeled to my friend down below. They were talking about yodeling in lonely places out on the plains, and it was less about communication and more about place.
So I was born in Butte, so I caught
Yeah.
message there. So were you looking at music from immigrants, or were you looking at something with mining, or what kind of songs and interests did you have in?
So what kind of songs was I researching when I was in Butte, and what was I doing? I'm repeating for the folks back at home. So when I was in Butte, I was there as a part of the Open Air Montana program, which does place-based artist residencies, including right here at Travelers Rest. Thank you, Travelers Rest. So I was a resident at the Clark Chateau in Butte, which is a mansion, I'm sure you probably know, but for everybody else. It was a mansion built by one of the Copper Kings for one of their children. It's changed hands many times, and it served a bunch of different functions in Butte. At one point, it was a music school, and I was just there to write music, actually. But I had access. I was also doing, at the same time, I was involved with the Butte Silverbow Archives New Songs for the Butte Mining Camps project, which was a fantastic project where they had a little yellow book of labor and miners songs that had been published in Butte for protesters and labor events, and they wanted new musicians to record those songs, and you had the option to, instead of using that book, to get something else from the archives. And so since I was already there and I had more time, I had a whole month to plumb the archives. While I was there, I started looking through, and I found this collection of this little collection about, oh geez, I'm gonna mess up his last name. Al something, the singing cowboy of Butte. And what's funny is, so I found this collection of music by a singing cowboy. I was looking for that kind of stuff, for singing cowboy music, and that's what most of the records I found were, singing cowboys or single singers with piano type of stuff, mostly kind of pop songs. And it seemed more like most of it were like family recordings of oh, here's little Susie singing this song for grandma back home. But this guy, Al, whose last name is escaping me, I feel embarrassed. He had one successful song that he had published for a cowboy movie. And then he had another one that he was writing and trying to record and send out to publishing companies. And so there was these records, and then a series of rejection letters from all the different companies saying, this is almost verbatim, "We did not ask for this submission or the one prior to that. This music is not appropriate for us. Please don't send any more." And it was funny listening to it, actually, because his recordings are from 1940, and they sound like almost even old-timey compared to what my great-grandfather was singing in 1930. There's a very operatic tenor with piano. I was going down, and so I kind of see the rejection letters, because by 1940 that was 30 years out of date, But he was apparently quite popular in Butte.
All right, well, I think for folks on Zoom especially, we need to wrap up, but I just wanted to say thank you again to Aaron. It's so great to have you. And I'm sure you're willing to stay for a little bit?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so come up and see what he's brought with him and ask more questions and have some more coffee and wait. Oh, wait, I have a question in the back.
Yeah, there is one question on Zoom. Where can we see you perform?
Where can we see you perform?
Oh gosh, I usually play music at the Union Club in Missoula once a month or once every other month. Not in January, but hopefully in February. Yeah, I try to get around most of Western Montana, really.
Cool.
Thank you.
He has a great website, so you can check it out. All right. And so next week we'll be here. Shirley Trahan from the Séliš Bay Culture Committee will be sharing traditional stories. Watch your email just in case of weather. But the show will go on, whether it's here or on Zoom only, and we'll let you know. So thanks everybody for coming out.
Thank you, Molly. It's an honor to be included with the great programming that you've got this season.